He had everything. Wealth that could reshape economies, connections that reached the highest political summits, and the image of a man who controlled destiny with a whisper. The Tycoon, known by many as the Baron, believed he was untouchable. Wrapped in designer suits, flanked by armored limousines, and applauded in boardrooms, he was the portrait of invincibility. But beneath the shimmering facade lay rot, and she, his mistress, had seen it all. She had been a shadow in his world of excess. Elegant, intelligent, mysterious, she played her role to perfection. Silent at diplomatic dinners, radiant at galas, and obedient in his private chambers. To the public eye, she was an accessory, a beautiful ornament in the arsenal of a man who had conquered everything. But he underestimated her. Behind every gaze, every nod, every whispered word of submission, she was documenting, storing, remembering. She wasn't just watching, she was planning. Their story began in Marrakesh, under the golden lights of an exclusive charity ball. She appeared out of nowhere, floating across the marble floors like a ghost from forgotten royalty. He noticed her not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. Her calm was unsettling, her silence strategic. When she accepted his invitation to Paris the following week, he thought he had won. In truth, the game had just begun, and he wasn't the one holding the cards. In the years that followed, she became part of his empire, quietly present in every major transaction, by his side in every photo that mattered. But while he grew more powerful, she grew more dangerous. She learned his routines, discovered his lies, met his enemies, and understood the mechanics of his power. Each password he whispered in confidence, each late-night phone call he took. Without suspicion, she archived everything. The Tycoon never questioned her loyalty. Why would he? She never resisted, never objected. Even when he humiliated her behind closed doors, even when he used her name in backroom negotiations as leverage, she never reacted. He thought he had tamed her. In reality, she was giving him the rope. It was in Dubai that he made his final mistake. During a high-level meeting, he offered her, without her knowledge, as a gift to an oil prince. A cultural courtesy, he said. Nothing unusual in their world of shadows, but for her, it was a declaration of war. That night, she stared at her reflection in the penthouse mirror and knew he had to fall. The preparation took over a year. Hidden microphones, encrypted drives, burner phones. She contacted former employees, blacklisted journalists, and even 2 victims who had sued him into silence. Piece by piece, she built a puzzle too perfect to dismiss. Not just financial fraud or corporate espionage, but personal horrors, manipulation, coercion, abuse. She wasn't just documenting crimes. She was exposing a monster, and the moment of revelation was near. He had just returned from a summit in Geneva, boasting about new acquisitions and political favors secured. She greeted him in silence, offering his favorite drink, smiling like always. That evening, as the private jet sliced through the night sky, she placed a black velvet box on the table between them. "A gift?" he asked, amused. She nodded. "It contains your truth." Inside was a sleek flash drive. Curious, he plugged it into the onboard system. What played next drained the blood from his face. Audio recordings of private threats, video clips of illegal deals, intimate footage of him degrading employees, documents, names, offshore accounts, all neatly arranged. "What is this?" he croaked. "Your reckoning," she said calmly. "Everything you've built was founded on shadows. I'm turning on the lights." He reached for her, desperate, but she was already on her feet. "Don't worry, you'll land safely tonight. But by morning, the world will know who you really are." As he sat in stunned silence, the jet descended into a storm. Not one of wind or rain, but of consequence. And this, the beginning of his fall, was just the first act. This story is far from over. What secrets remain hidden? What more does she know? And who else will be pulled into the abyss he created? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe he deserves what's coming? And if you know someone who needs to hear the truth about power, betrayal, and vengeance, share this video. Because some stories demand to be heard. Topic 2 of 8. The empire begins to crumble. When dawn broke over the Mediterranean coast, the world hadn't changed yet. But inside the Tycoon's private villa perched high above Monte Carlo, everything had already begun to unravel. The Baron, once the commanding voice of global markets and silent orchestrator of political tides, stood barefoot on his marble balcony, phone in hand, reading the first wave of headlines. The names of his shell companies were now public. Confidential. Emails had been leaked to watchdog groups and news agencies. Videos of private meetings, ones he assumed were safe within soundproof walls, were now on the front pages of international media. And worse, the woman responsible had vanished without a trace, leaving only the echoes of her final words aboard his jet. By midday, his advisors were in chaos. Phones rang non-stop. Security teams deployed emergency protocols, and legal counsels scrambled to contain a flood of subpoenas, accusations, and public outrage. Half his board members resigned within 24 hours. Several executives disappeared entirely, fearing implication or retaliation. Banks froze assets. Governments launched investigations, and the press, like wolves to blood, circled faster than he could spin. But amid the pandemonium, the Baron didn't flinch. Not yet. For years he'd survived economic crashes, betrayals, even attempted assassinations. He believed he could silence this storm too. He summoned his closest inner circle, those whose loyalty he believed unshakable. But what he found was not loyalty. It was fear. His chief strategist avoided eye contact. His head of security had already deleted his encrypted communications. And his lawyer, the same man who'd buried corporate corpses in offshore jurisdictions, refused to take the case. "We can't help you if she's released everything," the lawyer said. "You don't need a legal defense. You need an exit strategy." The Baron, livid, hurled his phone against the wall. But the damage wasn't limited to his empire. It was personal. The mistress had gone beyond revenge. She had gutted the mythology of his invincibility, exposing him not as a titan, but as a tyrant. And worse, she knew things that hadn't even surfaced yet. Names he had buried, crimes with no statute of limitation. In the privacy of his study, surrounded by paintings of ancestors who had ruled oil fields and arms syndicates, he replayed a video file she had labeled simply Epitaph. In it, she detailed his rise from ruthless startup manipulator to global overlord. She spoke calmly, without venom, as though narrating a documentary. Every phrase dripped with facts, timestamps, dates, voice memos. It was more than exposure. It was autopsy. Outside, protests formed, small at first, a handful of activists with signs. But by nightfall, drones hovered above his estate, broadcasting live footage of police roadblocks and furious investors chanting his name in rage. Stock prices plummeted. Celebrities who had once praised him now issued carefully worded statements distancing themselves. He had become radioactive, but the most searing blow came not from the public, nor the media, but from his own blood. His eldest son, heir apparent to the empire, released a statement condemning his father's actions. "I do not recognize the man described in these revelations," it read. "If even half of what is alleged is true, he is unworthy of the legacy our family built." Those words pierced deeper than subpoenas. For a man who had justified everything in the name of legacy, being disowned publicly was a crucifixion. He sat for hours in silence afterward, watching the statement play again and again, eyes dry, jaw locked. And yet, in all this chaos, she remained invisible. No trace of her, not in surveillance footage, not in customs logs, not in intercepted messages. Some claimed she had fled to Asia. Others whispered she was in hiding in South America. But the truth? No one knew. What they didn't understand was this. Her goal wasn't escape. It was control. She didn't vanish to hide. She vanished to observe. And as the Baron's empire began to burn, she watched from the shadows, to be continued in Topic 3. Topic 3 of 8, the shadows. She commands. While the Baron's world disintegrated in the harsh light of truth, she moved through the shadows like a specter from a forgotten legend. She was no longer the woman by his side, no longer the silent beauty he flaunted like a trophy. She was something else now, something forged in fire and betrayal. And as the media tore him apart, as former allies turned into enemies, she operated with a clarity of purpose that was almost divine. In a modest, flat nestled deep within an ancient quarter of Istanbul, she watched the fallout unfold on 3 different screens. One showed the rolling newsfeed, stock crashes, political leaders distancing themselves, investigative reporters digging into the Baron's darkest corners. The second streamed encrypted communications from her network, updating her on each phase of the plan. The third, a digital map, live tracking the locations of individuals she knew would become relevant soon. Whistleblowers, old partners, forgotten enemies. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was orchestration. This was her concerto. And every note played struck at the heart of a system that once tried to consume her. Her network wasn't new. Years before the Baron ever laid eyes on her, she had begun building it. Survivors of his empire, women silenced with money, employees fired for uncovering fraud, journalists whose stories were buried under lawsuits. She found them one by one, listening, recording, uniting. Together, they had spent years constructing the vault that now bled secrets into the world like ink into water. But she knew exposure wasn't enough. The world forgets headlines quickly. If she wanted lasting change, if she wanted to break more than just the man, she had to strike the roots. That meant targeting his legacy, his systems, his successors. So she activated Phase 2. The first target was a private school in Geneva, where the Baron had funneled millions to groom future allies among political elites. She released documents showing how the institution covered up unethical educational experiments funded by the Baron's foundation. Protests erupted, donations were pulled. Within days, the school faced closure. Next came the energy consortium he secretly chaired, the one that masked environmental devastation as innovation. With a few well-placed leaks, the real data surfaced. Forests razed, indigenous communities displaced, regulators bribed. Shareholders panicked, partners vanished, lawsuits piled up like autumn leaves in a storm. Every strike was calculated, every revelation timed to maximize chaos. But still, she remained unseen. Authorities combed. Through passport databases, financial trails, travel logs, nothing. She left no trace. Because she knew how he worked. His methods had taught her how to disappear. Meanwhile, the Baron descended into paranoia. He changed villas weekly, fired entire security teams, spoke only in analog rooms with no electronic devices. But even then her presence lingered. On his bed, he once found a red envelope with no stamp, no return address. Inside, a photo of the two of them at a gala, her eyes locked on his. Written on the back in elegant cursive, "You taught me silence. Now I speak louder than your empire ever screamed." He stopped sleeping, and while his world dimmed, hers grew brighter. She started appearing in whispers, not physically, but as legend. On online forums, she was called the Reckoner. Some said she was an AI. Others claimed she was a former spy. No one could prove anything, but the stories spread like wildfire. People inspired by her actions began to challenge their own oppressors. Her defiance became doctrine. In secret conferences and hushed conversations, governments began considering new laws based on the exposure she triggered. Whistleblower protection improved. Women in powerful firms found new channels of security. Her vengeance had birthed a movement, and it was only just beginning, because the Baron wasn't her only target. He was merely the first, and she was just getting started. While the world absorbed the tidal wave of revelations she had unleashed, the Baron struggled to breathe within the collapsing walls of his legacy. What was once a fortress of dominance now resembled a crumbling cathedral, haunted by the ghosts of those he had betrayed. But beneath the external chaos, a deeper, more personal storm raged. His past, the real past, not the one rewritten by publicists and historians, was clawing its way to the surface. It began with a phone call, an untraceable number, a voice he hadn't heard in 2 decades. Cold, calm, male. "She's not finished." The voice said, "You should never have touched her." The line went dead. That night, the Baron poured himself a glass of scotch, hands trembling, and opened a locked drawer in his private study. Inside were photographs, old, yellowing images from his early years as a rising oligarch. One photo in particular made his throat tighten. A group of 6 men and 1 woman standing under the golden glow of a chandelier in Moscow. Deals were made that night. Promises sealed with blood. One of them had warned him never to use the woman. "She's not like the others," they had said. He hadn't listened. Now, as pieces of that night resurfaced in media leaks, he realized she had retrieved more than he ever thought possible. Across the world, new documents emerged. They weren't about him directly, but about those connected to him. Former collaborators, ex-lovers, retired politicians who owed him favors. Each file struck like a bullet. Scandals erupted across industries: pharmaceutical corruption, art, theft, child trafficking, and all trails eventually led back to him, not through direct involvement, but through silence, complicity. He tried to rally allies. But what allies? Those who hadn't betrayed him were now under scrutiny themselves. No one wanted to be near the falling colossus. His name became taboo in diplomatic circles. Invitations vanished, private clubs revoked memberships, even his offshore banks began freezing accounts. Meanwhile, she continued weaving her narrative. From a safe house in the Scottish Highlands, she began collaborating with filmmakers. A documentary was in production, one that would not just expose, but narrate with her voice, her story. Not of a mistress scorned, but of a woman systematically weaponized, and the empire that underestimated her resolve. She refused to show her face. Instead, actors reenacted scenes from her memories: the opulence, the abuse, the manipulation. Footage blended with real documents, real recordings. The trailer alone sent shockwaves. Streaming platforms fought for distribution rights. Critics called it a masterpiece of reckoning, and amid the creative chaos, she never lost sight of her mission. She had discovered a network of underage trafficking, laundered through one of the Baron's minor holding companies. For years, it operated under the guise of an educational initiative in South Asia. Now, with evidence secured, she prepared a final dossier. It would be sent to international prosecutors, Interpol, and select journalists known for integrity. But timing was everything. She waited for his daughter's wedding, a spectacle planned for weeks, intended to repair the family image. The who's who of global society would be there? Cameras, dignitaries, a fragile mask of normalcy, and during the reception, while guests toasted under golden chandeliers and violins played Mozart, the news broke. Headlines screamed across devices. Guests gasped. The bride fainted. The groom fled. Security shut the event down in minutes. And the Baron, he watched it unfold live on a giant screen, surrounded by a sea of frozen smiles. The dossier was undeniable. There would be no recovery from this. not in this lifetime. Later that night, in the solitude of his shattered estate, he wandered through his private gallery, portraits of himself at summits, magazine covers, plaques of achievement. He smashed them one by one until the walls bled glass and gold. And still, she watched from afar, silent, steady, waiting for the next move. To angle while the world absorbed the tidal wave of revelations she had unleashed, the Baron struggled to breathe within the collapsing walls of his legacy. What was once a fortress of dominance now resembled a crumbling cathedral, haunted by the ghosts of those he had betrayed. But beneath the external chaos, a deeper, more personal storm raged. His past, the real past, not the one rewritten by publicists and historians, was clawing its way to the surface. It began with a phone call, an untraceable number, a voice he hadn't heard in 2 decades, cold, calm, male. "She's not finished," the voice said. "You should never have touched her." The line went dead. That night, the Baron poured himself a glass of scotch, hands trembling, and opened a locked drawer in his private study. Inside were photographs, old yellowing images from his early years as a rising oligarch. One photo in particular made his throat tighten. A group of 6 men and 1 woman standing under the golden glow of a chandelier in Moscow. Deals were made that night, promises sealed with blood. One of them had warned him never to use the woman. "She's not like the others," they had said. He hadn't listened. Now, as pieces of that night resurfaced in media leaks, he realized she had retrieved more than he ever thought possible. Across the world, new documents emerged. They weren't about him directly, but about those connected to him. Former collaborators, ex-lovers, retired politicians who owed him favors. Each file struck like a bullet. Scandals erupted across industries: pharmaceutical corruption, art, theft, child trafficking, and all trails eventually led back to him, not through direct involvement but through silence, complicity. He tried to rally allies, but what allies? Those who hadn't betrayed him were now under scrutiny themselves. No one wanted to be near the falling colossus. His name became taboo in diplomatic circles. Invitations vanished, private clubs revoked memberships. Even his offshore banks began freezing accounts. Meanwhile, she continued weaving her narrative. From a safe house in the Scottish Highlands, she began collaborating with filmmakers. A documentary was in production, one that would not just expose, but narrate, with her voice, her story. Not of a mistress scorned, but of a woman systematically weaponized, and the empire that underestimated her resolve. She refused to show her face. Instead, actors reenacted scenes from her memories, the opulence, the abuse, the manipulation. Footage blended with real documents, real recordings. The trailer alone sent shockwaves. Streaming platforms fought for distribution rights. Critics called it a masterpiece of reckoning. And amid the creative chaos, she never lost sight of her mission. She had discovered a network of underage trafficking laundered through one of the Baron's minor holding companies. For years, it operated under the guise of an educational initiative in South Asia. Now, with evidence secured, she prepared a final dossier. It would be sent to international prosecutors, Interpol, and select journalists known for integrity. But timing was everything. She waited for his daughter's wedding, a spectacle planned for weeks, intended to repair the family image. The who of global society would be there? Cameras, dignitaries, a fragile mask of normalcy. And during the reception, while guests toasted under golden chandeliers and violins played Mozart, the news broke. Headlines screamed across devices. Guests gasped. The bride fainted. The groom fled. Security shut the event down in minutes, and the Baron, he watched it unfold, live on a giant screen, surrounded by a sea of frozen smiles. The dossier was undeniable. There would be no recovery from this, not in this lifetime. Later that night, in the solitude of his shattered estate, he wandered through his private gallery, portraits of himself at summits, magazine covers, plaques of achievement. He smashed them one by one until the walls bled glass and gold, and still she watched from afar, silent, steady, waiting for the next move. Networks across continents went dark at the same hour, not due to failure, but by choice. They made space for one woman, one voice, one moment of reckoning. The mistress, until then a phantom in the media storm, was stepping into the light. For the first time, she would speak with her own face, her own words, her own truth. It wasn't a studio production. No polished set, no curated lighting. She sat in a plain chair, in front of a nondescript wall, wearing black. Her hair was loose, her eyes steady. She wasn't there to impress, she was there to testify. "I am not here to entertain you," she began. "I am not a headline. I am not your story to twist. I am the consequence." The world froze. She spoke for nearly 2 hours. No teleprompter, no commercial breaks. Her voice never faltered. She detailed the grooming, the manipulation, the threats, the erasure of identity. She described the feeling of becoming invisible inside his empire, how he had turned her into a tool, a shadow, a symbol. He didn't just break laws, he broke people. Viewers cried, some screamed, others simply stared in stunned silence. Across social media, the reaction was instantaneous. Hashtags in every language ignited like fire across a dry field. But the broadcast wasn't just about her pain, it was about systems. She named banks, firms, regulatory bodies that had looked the other way. She shared documents showing how governments had colluded in silence. She showed the receipts of the world's complicity in building monsters and then pretending to be shocked when those monsters devoured the powerless. But she didn't end with condemnation. She offered a challenge. Don't praise me. Don't. Make me your hero. If you see injustice, speak. If you see abuse, stop it. If you are in power, use it to dismantle the cage, not reinforce it. And with that, the screen faded to black. No applause, no closing credits, just silence. The reaction was seismic. In Buenos Aires, where the Baron now lurked in the ruins of his former world, he watched the broadcast unfold on a stolen feed. He hadn't shaved in weeks. He barely recognized himself. As her face filled the screen, something inside him twisted. Not regret, not guilt, but fear. True, unfiltered fear. He knew then that it was over. In the following days, mass resignations rocked the corporation she had named. International bodies opened new investigations. Governments scrambled to align themselves with her message. Even global summits shifted their agendas. But while the world reacted, she disappeared again, not because she feared retaliation, but because her mission was never about fame. She had said what needed to be said. Now, the world had to decide what to do with it. She returned to the shadows not to hide, but to rebuild. She founded a trust, the Witness Fund, dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and survivors of corporate abuse. Anonymous donations poured in. Within months, it became the most well-funded transparency organization in the world. And still, she never appeared in public again. But the Baron, he couldn't vanish. Interpol agents raided the Argentine villa within a week. They found him alone, ranting at invisible foes, surrounded by broken mirrors and defaced portraits. He was arrested without incident. As the cameras captured him in handcuffs, a reporter asked, "Do you have anything to say?" He paused, looked up. "She was supposed to love me," he whispered. That clip became the final piece of the documentary, a man who thought love was ownership. The Baron's arrest sent ripples through the corridors of the world's most powerful institutions. Images of his once proud figure, now hunched and shackled, flooded television screens and news feeds. The myth of the untouchable mogul had shattered. In its place remained a hollow man and a world scrambling to reckon with the system that had enabled him. But this was no ending. This was an aftershock, and every echo carried consequence. Court proceedings moved quickly. The mountain of evidence compiled by the mistress and her network was overwhelming. Financial crimes, human rights violations, conspiracy to obstruct justice. The charges alone read like a manifesto of corruption. But the trial became more than a legal process. It became a global moment of reflection. Survivors of other powerful men stepped forward. Whistleblowers, once silenced, now found courage. A cultural reckoning unfolded in courtrooms, boardrooms, and legislative halls. Governments formed task forces, international watchdogs gained traction, and the public, hungry for change, demanded transparency like never before, all because of her. And yet she stayed silent. She watched the trial from afar, in a secluded estate in Iceland, far from reporters and speculation. She gave no interviews, signed no book deals, but every night she documented, pages upon pages of handwritten notes, thoughts, observations, as if she were crafting a new kind of history, one that wouldn't be published, but preserved. The Baron, on the other hand, struggled to maintain composure in the public eye. In the courtroom, he attempted defiance, he denied, he mocked, he claimed victimhood. But every time he spoke, prosecutors countered with videos, documents, and testimonies, and the worst moment came not from evidence, but from silence. During cross-examination, the lead prosecutor played an unreleased clip from the Mistress Empire documentary. It was never aired. In it, the mistress sat in silence, staring into the camera. For 45 seconds, she didn't speak. No expression, just her presence. The room, full of reporters, judges, and onlookers, held its breath. "This," the prosecutor said, "is what your empire built, silence. And now it speaks louder than your words." The Baron looked away. Back in Iceland, she watched the moment play out on a secure feed. She turned off the screen, walked outside. The wind carried snow across the horizon. Stillness surrounded her, but inside she felt something shift. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but release. She wasn't the same woman who once stood in the shadows of his empire. She was no longer defined by what he did to her. Now she was defined by what she did with it. She wrote a letter that night, not to him, not to the public, but to the next woman who might one day find herself silenced by someone like him. "Your voice is your weapon," it read. "Use it, and when they call you dangerous, smile. That means they're afraid." The trial ended with a guilty verdict on all counts. The Baron was sentenced to life without parole. The court's decision was unanimous. But her story wasn't over. There was still one more thing left to do. The Baron was gone, not dead, but erased. His empire dismantled, his name stricken from corporate records, his legacy poisoned beyond repair. And yet for the mistress, one final thread remained, one last chapter that had to be written, not for vengeance, not even for closure, but for truth. She had kept it hidden for years. A file buried deep within an off-grid server containing the story of one life lost in the margins of his empire. Her sister. It had happened long before she ever met the Baron. Back when she was just a young woman, navigating a world that didn't forgive ambition. Her sister had taken a job at one of his shell companies. Bright, determined, hopeful. She discovered too much, too fast. When she tried to report it, she disappeared. The case was never solved. Her body was never found, until now. The mistress had spent years collecting fragments, witnesses too afraid to speak, corrupted files, hidden testimonies. And now she had everything she needed. Evidence not only of the crime, but of the cover-up. Proof that the Baron himself had authorized the silencing. She didn't send the file to the media. She didn't hand it to a prosecutor. She took it to the one place where her sister had once found joy, a university in southern France, where she had studied art history. There, on the steps of its library, she placed a small plaque in memory of the truth that fought to be seen. Beside it, a USB drive sealed in crystal. Anyone who wished to see could access the full truth. Not redacted, not dramatized, just raw, painful reality. And with that, she walked away. She never returned to public life, never published a memoir, never gave another speech. But her story lingered. Young women spoke her name in classrooms. Her quotes adorned murals in cities across continents. Survivors found courage in the silence she once broke. Whistleblower laws changed. Boards diversified. Transparency became less a buzzword, more a standard. The mistress didn't become a brand. She became a symbol. And the Baron, he died in prison 6 years later, alone, forgotten. Not a single person claimed his body, but every year, on the anniversary of her global broadcast, people gathered in silence. They held candles, they recited her words. If they call you dangerous, smile. That means they're afraid. And they remembered that one woman with no army, no weapons, and no name had dismantled a king. This was not a story about power. This was a story about what happens when silence ends.